Welcome to All Rise, ladies and gentlemen. I am not your host usually. It's usually Derek Caldwell, but Derek Caldwell is taking care of a emergency situation. Otherwise, he would be here because he really wanted to have this conversation as well with our guest, Bethel McGrew, who does join us. It's going to be a wide-ranging conversation. We don't have a specific topic. We got a lot of things that we want to talk about because Bethel talks on a lot of stuff. Bethel is a math PhD, by the way, a teacher, an essayist, social critic. Actually, I don't like the word social critic. I like, in this particular context, she's a social diagnostician. I think you do a good job, Bethel, of taking a look and seeing what's going on. You don't just critique, you also offer some understandings of why things are the way they are in order to get us to a new understanding of where they could be. She's written in First Things, World, National Review, The Critic. By the time you will have seen this interview, Bethel's piece on Michael Jackson relative to the movie that just came out and some of the discussion about really what happened with the kids will have been out for quite some time with the Daily Wire, and she's doing a deeper dive into that as well, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. She's also contributed to essay anthologies on Jordan Peterson, the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, and which I want to actually talk to her about as well during the conversation, wide-ranging as it might be. So with that, welcome, Bethel, to the show. It's great to have you on.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Yeah. I also find out that you are a fellow Billy Joel enthusiast.
Very much so.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Me too. And the often unfairly maligned works on popular TV and all these things. Like the guy was great at this. He was really good at writing music and writing lyrics. So I don't know. I don't get the criticism, but there you have it.
I don't know. Yeah, I wrote a whole piece of Billy Joel don't get no respect. You know, he was left off of this New York Times list of greatest living songwriters,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of people complained about that, rightly so.
Mm-hmm.
He definitely belongs on there.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember one of the songs that I really liked by him was oh gosh, I'm forgetting the title now, but I think it's called "Good Night Saigon," about
Vietnam.
about Vietnam War and
Yeah.
the lyrics, the hum of the rotors, and we waited for them to arrive. Like that really puts you there. I mean, it really did a great job of putting you there. So anyway, I'm with you on that. We talked about the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. And there's something I want to ask you about with regard to this, because it's a question I've been thinking about for a long time. As a person who is a Christian who tries to write books as much as I can that speak to the credibility of the Christian faith as it pertains to current cultural moments and current cultural trends, because I do believe, to quote Leslie Newbegin, that the gospel and the person of Christ is actually eternally contemporary, though he operated in an ancient world far different than 21st century, the 21st century world, and in the Middle East as opposed to the West. He keeps being relevant over and over again to our current cultural moment. So I try to write books that argue to Christianity, not necessarily from Christianity, and seen some success with that. But a lot of Christian writers who do a good job understanding things aren't having or haven't had the same effect that non-Christian writers have had on the culture when it comes to the Bible, Jordan Peterson being one of them. And of course, famously sort of, not outed isn't the right word, but sort of famously made clear that he wasn't a Christian when he did the Surrounded debate, where a kid asked him, basically, you're a Christian, right? He says, no, you're saying that. And everyone sort of realized, oh, we've been a little bit overzealous in our use of the word Christian. But my point here is that he and others, and I would take even some of the speakers at a conference that you and I have been to, the ARC conference over in London, some of those speakers who speak are sort of Christian adjacent, and they have this tremendous impact where people are starting to read the Bible and take it seriously again, but they're non-Christians writing about Christian-y things. So my question to you would be, as someone who speaks into this space and understands this kind of stuff, what do you account for the fact that non-Christians writing about Christianity seem to have as much or greater impact as Christians writing about it do?
That's a great question. There are a lot of complicated factors. I think I would say part of the answer is mundane stuff about, marketing and publishing access and that sort of thing. I think a good example of this might be the British historian Tom Holland,
Hmm.
who, his book Dominion generated a lot of conversation, but Holland himself, I think, struggles with approaching Christian faith himself personally. He had a good discussion with Peter Williams recently where
Hmm.
they, very respectful dialogue back and forth, but in the end, Holland sounded, honestly not too different from a guy like Bart Ehrman, except that he's a lot more winsome and friendly, and so he presents these things in a way that Christians kind of feel more comfortable chatting with him. Um, but I think there can be a tendency of people to tune out Christian voices because they kind of think, well, of course you're going to say that. That's your job, right?
Yeah.
You're a professional. You're a pastor. You're a theologian. You're a Christian historian. So Rodney Stark is an example of a Christian historian who was out there kind of writing these books years before Holland got around to it,
Yeah.
but nowhere near as many people bought them, right? And so then Holland comes out, writes Dominion. It's like, oh my gosh, I never thought about this before.
Yeah.
And it was a little bit like that in his own kind of distinct way with Jordan Peterson, because he's repackaging things that are quite, for Christians, it's like, yeah, you think? This is not like earth shattering.
Hmm.
But it's a little bit like, when a teenager's mom tells him, hey, you need to clean your room. He's like, okay, mom. Like, of course my mom's going to tell me to clean my room. But Jordan Peterson says, clean your room. It's like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
I really need to clean my room,
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it's the outsider factor sort of it's a coolness factor in a way. It's kind of it's like, well, okay, if that guy is saying it, then he's got to be coming at this without an agenda, right? Without his own kind of bias. So there really must be something to this. I really need to go explore it.
Yeah.
And I feel like, that's a little bit unfair in a way. It's sort of like in academia, if you're trying to write about the Bible or the New Testament and you want to cite somebody who's a more conservative scholar, you're going to encounter resistance to that because, like, oh, well, why are you that person is an apologist? Why would you cite him? It's like, because I think he's a good scholar and he's doing good research, and it's like there's an intrinsic assumption that, well, there's got to be some kind of a subjective thing this person has got going. He can't really have come to this conclusion objectively.
Yeah.
So I think that helps kind of explain the kind of aura around these people. And there's also just the sort of the interest and the excitement of like, well, where are they going to go next? Like in their own personal journey, like is Peterson going to become a Christian or is he not? And there's a kind of almost like a soap opera like drama around that. And sadly in Peterson's case, he's just become very ill and he's really kind of faded, I think, from. I feel bad sometimes when I talk about him in the past tense. It's like he's not dead,
Right.
like he's still out there, but he's no longer really engaged in the conversation, and I'm sad about that.
Yeah, me too. Well, me too. I heard him for the first time at the ARC conference last year, live. I've heard him before, obviously on video and that kind of thing, but I'd never heard him live before. And to see him sort of go on without notes and do his thing is really something. I'll tell you one thing about him that I find fascinating. So I'm going to speak about him in the present tense.
Yeah.
What he did at the ARC conference in the past is indicative of the kind of thing he does in terms of his attitude. Was when he was actually moderating a panel discussion, he did this thing where he would lean in, probably because of his psychologist days. He would lean in and really listen to the panelists and then have the panelists steer the discussion as opposed to being the moderator who steered the discussion. I found that fascinating and quite refreshing, which suggests a teachability, a learner's mindset, and living up to that phrase he has in his book, where assume that someone else in the room is smarter than you on at least one thing. And I thought that was really quite refreshing. But the point you made was really good one, I think, is there's a character arc to the idea that someone has growth. You don't watch a movie where the guy stays the same when the character is introduced as A, and he stays A pretty much the same even keel throughout the entire movie. Sometimes he stays he gets corrupted, he gets something, he gets cynical, and then he comes back to himself. That's a great character arc. Sometimes he's this terrible person who becomes a moral person at the end. That's a character arc. A guy who stays the same the whole time is kind of boring. You don't want to watch that drama. But with folks like Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson and a few others too, you see a sort of a character arc developing, and you can't wait to see what unfolds next. That's a really good insight. I didn't think about it that way.
Well, and I mean, I guess I should qualify that a little bit, is that I do think sometimes people get their hopes up that there's going to be more of an arc
Yeah.
than there actually turns out to be. I got a little bit irritated at a certain point with all the podcasts and the takes, like, Jordan Peterson is about to become a Christian, or he just said this, or
Yeah.
Tom Holland is about to, I think, is he a Christian yet? Like, somebody asked me, and I'm like, no, he's not, and I don't think he's going to be in the near future. It's not really like that. I think just because these guys are curious and friendly and articulate and willing to have, friendly dialogue with Christians, it really doesn't mean that they're on the cusp of something. So I do think I saw a lot of wishful thinking along those lines, to be honest.
Well, but that speaks to something as well, is that with that wishful thinking, we sort of impose a Hollywood script onto life, and it almost never works out that way. Sometimes it does, rarely, and that's the reason why we go to the movies, because we see resolution that's neat and tidy, where we don't see it necessarily in the real world. So we have that escapism, but we impose it on the real world, and we get hopeful. Tom Holland's a Christian, or Jordan Peterson's a Christian, or whatever it might be, which is why what happened with The Surrounded was so sort of like deflating. It seemed like the end of
That was really
act.
sad.
Yeah.
In my understanding of how that was set up is that there was a failure to communicate clearly with everybody, so that the young people thought they were going to be debating a Christian, and then they were really coming at Peterson hard. That one kid in the viral clip, especially, and it was I felt so bad for Peterson, because it's like he had walked into there in good faith. He wasn't trying to present himself as something he wasn't, but it sounds like maybe the organizers had. And that was, a lot of people sort of look at that as a bit of a watershed moment in a bad way for Peterson, because it showed how he'd sort of lost his grip on, his finger wasn't on the pulse of things anymore, I guess, or the zeitgeist. And it's this image of Gen Z kind of rejecting him, where maybe he spoke very well to elder millennials, let's say, but this kind of rising, it's a generation that knows not Peterson, right? To sort of use a biblical phrase. And it's just, now they're listening to Nick Fuentes and those kinds of voices, and he's just, it's like, okay, boomer, like they're not really tuning into him.
Well, so let's look at that then, because I think of, well, let's talk about Nick in a second, because there is a phenomenon. You're someone who's very active on social media, especially X, which is where a lot of this conversation is happening. So let's put a pin in it. Remind me to come back to it if I don't come back to it, because there's something else about the story arc I want to think about with regard to non-Christians speaking about Christianity in ways that are positive. And you brought up Ehrman, and of course, he's not a friend to sort of like biblical, historical Christianity so much as he kind of wants to dismantle it. But he wrote a book recently, Love Thy Stranger, where he talks about Christian ethics, specifically the ethics of Jesus in his life, and how it is a model for how we should actually act, and his admiration for the way in which Jesus treated especially people who were outside of the fold, Good Samaritan kind of a thing, and all this stuff, like who is my neighbor kind of a thing. And he did a discussion. It was touted as a debate. It was a discussion that was debate-ish. It wasn't formal, with Ross Douthat on Ross's show. And I thought it was an excellent conversation. He pointed out some of the things. I thought of you and your parents. By the way, if I didn't say this for our audience, by the way, Bethel McGrew is the daughter of Lydia and Tim McGrew, both of whom are friends, both of whom are brilliant, which is why the genetic pool really kind of coalesced with Bethel as well. So that's great for you. You won the genetic lottery on the intelligence thing. Congratulations. But you guys also speak about the cumulative case for the resurrection. And one of the things that Ross did during the conversation with Bart Ehrman, and I thought of you guys immediately on this. I'm going to get to the story arc in a second, guys, I promise. I'll get there. But I just thought about you guys, because what Douthat did was he brought up some timeline issues that the typical Christian scholar debating the earlier dating of the resurrection of the gospel narratives and the resurrection narrative, of course, entailed in that. Was he brought up some timeline stuff about Paul's death not being recorded in Luke, Acts, and the destruction of the temple and all this stuff, and he brought it up with Ehrman. And what I thought was fascinating, and I thought of you guys immediately, was that's not a minimal facts approach. It's more of a max data approach, which we had a podcast with your mom about. But Ehrman responded to it as if it was a thing to respond to. It wasn't the kind of thing he just dismissed. He responded to it, and then he kind of moved the ball somewhere else and didn't actually substantively discuss it in the way that I would hope he would have, which suggested to me that Douthat had really done a good job of presenting that. So I don't know if you saw that discussion. I thought there was some cool things he brought up that weren't standard minimal facts kind of a stuff. I'm not totally against the minimal facts approach, but I thought it was great because he brought it up in a completely testable environment with a guy who is the guy on this, and it was respected. I just thought it was really great stuff. I don't know if you had a comment on that. Hey, we're taking a break from the content for just one quick second while I bring an important message to you. Embrace the Truth is a donor-supported ministry, and we simply couldn't do what we do without the generous support of people like you. If you've been encouraged or challenged by our content, would you consider becoming a ministry partner? Just go to embracethetruth.org and click the donate button in the top right corner, or head directly to embracethetruth.org/donate. Every gift, large or small, helps us continue to proclaim the truth with boldness and grace in a culture full of conflict that's also searching for meaning. Thank you so much for standing with us. Now, back to the content.
Yes, I actually wrote a whole post about this, and it was quite a popular post. I called it "End of an Era," EHRA. See what I did there?
I see what you did there.
Yeah, people liked that. I there were so many facets of that discussion that were so interesting, and you're absolutely right. I appreciated, and I told Douthat this later that I liked that, and Douthat is familiar with my folks' work, actually, specifically some of my mom's stuff, and like you're saying, I appreciated it that he did home in on the details of the texts. The accuracy in small details. He's also a fan of Peter J. Williams, so the sort of thing that he gets into in the book "Can We Trust the Gospels?" Douthat was kind of bringing that out, and he made the very good point that if Ehrman is going to go out there and try to accuse the Gospels of inaccuracies and say, well, this is evidence against their credibility, Douthat is pointing out, okay, but then if there are a bunch of places where they're accurate, then that's got to count as evidence for their credibility.
Right.
Right? Ehrman kind of dipped and ducked and did his thing. But I liked the fact that Douthat was willing to go there, and it wasn't just a kind of a minimalist thing. And I also think there's an interesting, but you were also touching on this other interesting thread here, which is the status game, right? And Ross's position as a guy who, on the one hand, he's not a scholar specialist in this stuff, but he does have social status because he's a New York Times columnist. And so, in that sense, we could say he's a cultural elite. Maybe even in a way that some Bible scholars are not. They don't have cultural cash in that sense. And because Douthat knows enough about the material, he can press Ehrman in a knowledgeable and intelligent way. So, he clearly does kind of know his stuff. And another thing about Douthat's position is that Douthat is not in any way beholden to gatekeepers in the discipline of biblical studies. He's just an enthusiastic amateur who reads this stuff for fun. And so he doesn't have to worry like, oh no, and, what about my publishing, my, conferences and am I going to get invited to the thing? He doesn't have to worry about any of that, right? He has the freedom to, explore what interests him and discard what doesn't interest him. And he doesn't have to keep, looking over his shoulder and worrying about that. And so I think that made him in some ways a stronger opponent for Ehrman than, unfortunately, even some people who present themselves as evangelicals, and they put themselves forward like, well, I'm the guy to debate Bart Ehrman, but they actually don't do a very good job is partly because I think they're, you know, that they're trying to appeal to the gatekeepers, and that actually limits the strength of their argument.
So, okay, you hit on something there that I think about a lot. Derek and I talk about this all the time about the perception of trying to become one of the good ones, you know, where we do this with regard to social issues. When something comes up, whether it's regarding race or it's regarding gender or it's regarding sexuality or whatever it is, and we want to make sure that we maintain an evangelical position, but we also are one of the good ones. So we say things in a certain way, and I'm all for wholesome talk. Let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, and for persuasion in a godly way, and other kind of things. But there comes a time when a little bit more force is needed in our conversations. But sometimes there's such a deference to the gatekeepers. I don't know. Maybe you're touching on it. There's times that I get frustrated where it's like it's time to actually stop being so deferential. I'm not saying don't be nice. I'm saying stop being so deferential to the gatekeepers to say, oh, well, this is legitimate and this is a legitimate criticism, so let me go through. It's not sometimes legitimate. It's just what they've said all the time. Derek and I, Derek specifically has been writing a lengthier article on Paul and the writings and the attribution of authorship to Paul with certain things. And the more he dives into it, and I think this is going to be a fascinating article, which I think should be a book, the more he dives into it, he begins to see almost all the discussion about which letters Paul wrote and which letters Paul didn't are almost entirely based on agenda. Like, this isn't the Paul I like. He says things that I don't like, so he couldn't have written that. That has to be somebody else. Or everyone's been saying Paul didn't write 2 Corinthians, so he didn't write 2 Corinthians. Well, that's just, consensus becomes just repeating because the gatekeepers say it. So you're finding a sense of, when you watch some of the debate happening, that we're appealing to the gatekeepers too much.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. And I try myself, even when I approach, let's take a topic like Jesus mythicism, okay, like Jesus never existed. Now, it is in fact true that no respectable scholar believes that Jesus never existed. But I try not to frame it that way because I'm aware that there are debates, the authenticity of the Gospel of John, for example, where people could say, well, most respectable scholars, think that John didn't write the Gospel of John. And my response is like, well, I don't care, I just care about the arguments. And so even with something really obvious like Jesus' existence, I try to present that as you should believe Jesus existed because there are good arguments for it, right? And the arguments against it are really bad. It's not necessarily just, well, everybody agrees on this, because that in itself, I don't want to make that the measure of truth.
Right. Well, yeah, and this as a lawyer, there's sort of something in here that resonates with me, is that that's why we have competing experts in a case. Someone will have an expert on some issue. I did a lot of civil litigation, so I didn't do the criminal stuff. My stuff was not nearly as TV worthy as the stuff that I did. It was product liability stuff, and whether or not a certain part failed and the recall was the right kind of recall you should have done, kind of a thing, which is, of course, makes everyone yawn, and everyone's listening to me describe it is probably saying, you did that for a living? But I did. But you do have competing experts, and you'll have a metallurgist, or you'll have a physicist of some kind, or an engineer. And there is this tendency to try to over-impress somebody with the largesse of the person who's speaking. But the reality is, a lot of times, the mechanic comes in. He's like, yeah, I got all that. This is what I saw. This is what happened. This is the part. I'm telling you, I saw this. And that person has as much real-life expertise as the person does in terms of theoretical expertise. So we tend to give some deference to the cultural elites, as it were, we just got done talking about, because they're cultural elites. And then you have someone like Douthat who comes in, who is, in one sense, the mechanic, who's like, look, I'm just being real. And I can do that because I don't have an agenda and I don't have gatekeepers to worry about. I really like that point you made. That's good. And that's part of how you write, actually, which is what I really like, is the stuff that you write about. You take a look at some of the issues, and you write from look, I'm just going to tell you like how I see it. And I know there's going to be people mad at me about it, but I'm going to write some stuff that I think is true based on the evidence I see. So I'm going to tread into some dangerous territory in a second here. Not dangerous territory, that's probably not the way to put it. Some choppy waters, as it were. There's a cultural phenomenon that just happened, and everyone loved it, and I watched it, and it was a movie that I really enjoyed. Michael, on the Michael Jackson movie. And yes, there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not that movie not only lionized Michael Jackson in some ways, and it did actually show some of his oddities. It wasn't like it was completely divorced of the fact that, he had this bizarre, like, desire to stay a child forever kind of a thing. But it didn't even address the other issues with regard to the claims of child sexual abuse. And you're right about that. And despite the popularity and despite the sort of like, hey, we forgot that, you're like, no, let's not forget that. So you didn't cater to the gatekeepers. So let's talk about that for just a little bit. I know you wrote a piece in the Daily Wire about it. So first of all, what was the title of the piece on the Daily Wire about it?
I think that, and I don't write the title. It's a typical freelance thing. But
Yeah.
I think the title they gave it is what the Michael Jackson revival says about America.
Okay. Yeah. And so what does the Michael Jackson revival say about America in light of the fact that there are some troubling facts about his life that just didn't get discussed in the movie?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. Just now, you said that I'm ignoring the gatekeepers, and there's that's the Michael Jackson topic gets very interesting here because there's different classes of gatekeepers. So there are the gatekeepers who run his estate, who are trying to manage his reputation and project this this very cleaned up, halo polishing image of him. So yes, in that sense, I don't care about the gatekeepers, but there's also gatekeepers in the sense of mainstream media, the critics who didn't like the movie. It was not a critically popular movie. It was much more popular with fans than with critics, and that class of people has not tended to be very friendly to Jackson over the years. And I mean, that's a bit of an understatement. And so what I actually see in the Michael Jackson phenomenon is the people going to see it, the people sending his music back to the top of the charts. It's kind of a populist revival because he was the king of pop, right? He and he wasn't especially political, right? He appealed to everybody. Global phenomenon, actually, not just an American phenomenon. But
Right.
I think America specifically. If you look back at the music video for "Man in the Mirror," and you see there's all these clips of like different presidents, Republican and Democrat presidents, and there's just this sense of American vitalism and optimism, and this sense of like everyone's buying the same records, we're watching the same movies, the same TV shows, and there's a sense of like cultural unity. And now it's so fragmented. So I think people look back to peak Michael Jackson, and it's sort of like they're looking back nostalgically at peak America. And they kind of want to get back to that thing that's been lost, that sense of unity and optimism, and let's just kind of come together and listen to some great music. And then in the middle of all that, it's like, well, okay, but did you know that there's this really sordid stuff that nobody wants to think about? And I think that's just it. Nobody wants to think about it. It's so dark. It's so unpleasant. It taints happy memories of great music. And people are just like, please, can I just get back to the music? And I think that's the gamble that his estate made. And so then, when people see critics or New York Times writers going, well, okay, but he was probably a pedophile, it's like, oh, just be quiet, and like, and he wasn't even proven guilty in a court of law. And, there's probably more to that story, and I just kind of want to like what I like, and I don't want to accept the the respectable opinion about Michael Jackson. And this is kind of part of a bigger trend of rebelling against what's considered respectable, what's considered elite. And I think I draw a comparison to the election of Donald Trump, who's also an entertainer, right? An incredibly popular, charismatic figure,
Hmm.
right? He's like, I'm here for you, for the people, by
Yeah.
the people, for the people, it's sort of like Michael Jackson. Trump will say, the establishment have tried to crucify me, they try to assassinate me, but they can't keep me down, and I'm still here, and I'm still for all
Yeah.
of you guys. There's something really powerful in that. And so then I think you have to be discerning and be able to say, on the one hand, yes, we have been lied to a lot by gatekeepers, by the elite, in COVID era, all these kinds of things. Um, Lots of things presented as accepted wisdom and truth that we have to think for ourselves and reject. But we can't get into the mindset of, okay, just because it's a respectable narrative, I'm going to ignore it. There's got to be nothing to it. Sometimes maybe there's a reason. Sometimes maybe there's good evidence,
Right.
and you can't think tribally. You have to take things, one issue at a time.
Well, that's where I was going to, you sort of answered the question I was going to ask was in light of that, in light of the legitimacy of people's concern about gatekeepers sort of lying to you about big things. And then the gatekeepers are sort of keeping this away. How do you discern? How do you find out what really is true? Because there is a heartstring to this thing as well. Like I sat in that movie theater, and I was taken back.
Yeah.
You're far younger than me, so you don't remember what it was like
Yep.
to be at the Victory Tour. I do.
Yep.
And it was something. It was really something. This is years before all the other stuff came out. And the level of disappointment I felt at the time when that stuff came out was almost as it was proportionally crushing as it was uplifting. So, in light of the fact, I guess I have a two-part question. In light of the fact that it seems to me the reason why the Michael Jackson movie is so popular is because we're tired of cynicism. We're a little tired of the negative.
Yeah.
Everything is so downer. We have various opinions on Iran. We have, what's going to happen with gas prices? Is the world going to end? Is AI going to take all of our jobs? Young people especially need some semblance of hope. Here comes this movie that is just like, by the way, amazing music, world changing in many ways, and it's positive. Um, uh, so I guess one is, do you think that that's part of the reason why it's like, there's this desire to hang on to something really, really positive and hopeful? Um, and I guess a subpart to that is, what do you, as someone far younger than me, account for the fact that people your generation and even younger are finding his music to be like not, oh, that's old, and my dad listened to that, and even in some senses, my grandpa listened to that, which makes me feel horribly, horribly old. But that's true. I have friends who
Yeah.
have grandkids, and they were friends of mine who went to those concerts with me. So yeah, one is there just this desire for optimism, almost at any cost, and two, what accounts for the fact that young people are sort of getting nostalgic right now? Because there is this weird nostalgia that's happening where kids are buying like phones that can be connected Bluetooth to their iPhone, but it's a phone that mounts to the wall and has a cord, and they're talking on it. Like, as you survey the terrain, what are you thinking is a cause for all that?
Yeah, so many directions to go there.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I was kind of already touching on this earlier when I talk about my piece that the that optimism and positivity that Jackson embodies, it's a lost era of America, right? Um, you know, and I think about especially the Reagan years. I think in the '80s, you think about what Reagan embodied as a president, and he even gave Jackson an award for raising awareness about I forget what it even was, but it's so wholesome, it's feel good, it's positive, it's morning in America,
Hmm.
right? All those kinds
Right.
of vibes. Um, and I think as well, Jackson in particular, he built this image for himself of a person who was very childlike. I didn't really have a childhood, and so now I want to give back to all the children of the world, and it's this wholesomeness and innocence, and there's all these scenes in the movie of him visiting sick kids in the hospital and this sort
Yeah.
of stuff. Um, so I think people are drawn to innocence as well, and that they love this idea of something that's just pure, and
Hmm.
like not tainted. And then, to your question about why young people are getting into it, why the music isn't aging. I mean, I think really great pop music is it is timeless, and it wasn't just Jackson, but a whole team around him. The team of writers, the incredible musicians, the band created uh, absolutely iconic grooves, hooks,
Mm-hmm.
and it's still fresh. The
Yeah.
music is just it's just that good.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, when you look at the music landscape now, it's very, it's very tepid. It's very samey.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's hard to find really creative energy, and so Jackson really was a one in a million creative genius, and so people crave that. They're kind of looking back to that, um, and so there's that artistic element. I think also, because I've been thinking about this as well. Why is it that, because I normally think of young people as sensitive to things like abuse allegations, right? So I might have thought a priori that they'll be like, oh, well, we're going to cancel Jackson because of all this,
Right.
sordid
Exactly.
stuff around him, right? Somehow that hasn't happened, and maybe, maybe one reason for that is, again, this kind of gets back to the image Jackson presented and the aura around him that the movie emphasizes is the misunderstood, awkward, um, outsider, loner figure, right? Think about like Edward Scissorhands, right?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of or the Beast,
Mm-hmm.
Beauty and the Beast. Like nobody understands this person. He's eccentric. He's weird. Um, the media is mean to him and that kind of thing. And I do see a tendency among younger people to gravitate to the weird, eccentric, outsider person. Maybe because they're a little bit eccentric themselves.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of young people deal with, mental issues. A lot of them might be on the autism spectrum. I think, by the way, Jackson was on the autism spectrum, and so that's another kind of thread here.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of people kind of young people maybe identify with him to some extent. It's like, oh, he's kind of like me, like um, he's weird and awkward and he has trouble connecting with people normally, but I do too. Um, and so it's so great that a guy like him, who's a little bit like me in some of these ways, is so cool and such a genius and succeeded so much. And it's almost like a bit of wish fulfillment in a way.
Yeah.
So that's, a little more psychoanalytical maybe than you were expecting, but it's a thought that I've had.
No, but something about that resonates with me because one of the reasons why I think there is this sense in which we have bubbles in culture. We have the .com bubble. We have the various bubbles of that happen in financial markets. We had what I do firmly believe was a social contagion with regard to the gender identity issues, and the data seems to show that with this sharp rise in people saying they identified as a gender other than they were born, and then a sudden decline in that, which was by half people were. So that's indicative that this wasn't really an actual phenomenon so much as it was a social contagion, where people were just starting to identify because they didn't know what to identify as, so to speak, and we were valorizing these people who were identifying as such, and so the need to be I'm awkward, I'm weird, I don't know, I don't understand, maybe I'm this, and that gives me a sense of identity and purpose. I think there's something to this. I think this isn't just armchair psychoanalytics. I think this is actually data that shows this
Yeah.
kind of thing. And so with that desire to I identify with a guy who is a little awkward but obviously gifted in a way that you can't really build. You can't become that because you practiced hard. Although he did do that. So there's this this specialness that's there that we all want to sort of hang on to. But I think that's also one of the reasons why when I say these bubbles come up and they pop, one bubble that never seems to pop is reality. Despite our best efforts to try to sort of either simulate it or distort it or collapse it in some way, reality seems to endure despite all the bubbles. I mean, I think you're seeing this with AI soon. I think we're not going to be as fascinated with it as we are currently, especially in light of some of the practical limitations on the way AI is being developed. I mean, soon the money's going to run out, and the resources will at some point, but who knows? We'll see. But reality tends to endure. And Christianity has been around for 2,000 years, and it tends to endure all the bubbles. It doesn't pop. It does, have its dips and its ebbs and its flows in popularity, but it seems to endure, and it's got a special fascination with people right now. I wonder if part of that is because Jesus looked at weirdos or of his day and said, you know what, you're not that weird. I'm good. Come along, and he's about redemption. He's not saying, I affirm everything. He's not a constant affirmer. He is a redeemer, and he wants to change people, but he took people that, Zacchaeus is a good example. Everybody hated Zacchaeus, and he says, I'm going to your house. Now, from a Middle Eastern perspective, that is such an upending of the way things should go, because Jesus is this popular guy. He walks into this village. As a Middle Easterner, I already know what's going to happen. Everyone's going to invite them to his house. So the Bible doesn't necessarily talk about that in detail, about how much people would have invited him to the house, but I know that would have happened. And I know there was some indication of it in the text. But then he sees this guy hiding behind the big leaves of a sycamore tree, and he's getting all tarry and nasty with the sap that comes from sycamore trees because he doesn't want anybody to see him. And Jesus sees him and says, I'm going to your house, which was an affront in many ways to the people around him who had status. And he says, I'm going to go to your house. And everyone gets upset with him. And so he loses lots of followers. It would be the equivalent of basically saying something that, tanks the number of followers on X or whatever social media you have. And he did it on purpose. So I think that there's a bit of an affinity for Jesus in that sense, and the Michael Jackson phenomenon, in a weird way, is indicative of the fact that we have a culture who wants someone to say, I identify, or I understand what you're going through. And transformation is available to you. I want you to stay who you are in one sense, but not in another sense. So I think there's something about that I think is endearing. And it's not just mere psychoanalytical, I think, speculation on our part. One thing I wanted to go back to, by the way, you said something that about the music that I thought was interesting relative to the current AI phenomenon. At ARC last year, someone said something during one of the panel discussions. I have it in my notes. My notes are in front of me, so I don't know who had said it, but they said this, is that there's this concern that maybe human beings are less than we thought we were because AI can do the things that we do. And he said maybe the issue isn't that AI is so good that it imitates humans. Maybe it's that we're so bad now at where everything is so samey that we're easy to duplicate. And so AI slop is almost indistinguishable from human slop because the common denominator is not creativity, it's actually slop. What do you think about that?
Well, I absolutely, and I'm a big fan of the Rick Beato channel. I don't know if you watch that much, but he's incredible. Once you start watching his channel, it's like potato chips. You're not gonna be able to eat just one. But he's a musician and kind of a pop music historian and critic, and he's got a great channel where he just kind of breaks down what makes classic songs great. And he's talked quite a bit about AI slop and human slop, and he made exactly that point, that at this point the landscape of non-AI music is so sloppy that it's almost like we deserve what we're going to get. Like, if computer generated stuff starts topping the charts, it's like, let the AI slop and the human slop duke it out, because at this point Rick is like, I don't even care anymore. Like there was this country, this fake country song, and Rick kind of talked about that, and he's like, the thing is, like, this isn't, these lyrics, they're not that much different from formulaic stuff. Like, country music, it's not Hank Williams and Loretta Lynn and Johnny Cash anymore. It's very bland, generic, trucks and guns and sex, and beer and whatever, right? And it's not that difficult for an AI to imitate that and be kind of indistinguishable. But you're never gonna get an AI Johnny Cash. You're never gonna get an AI Hank Williams. And this is what I talk about, because I've written some about AI music and AI art in general. It's like, okay, if you take, so to take an example, one of my favorite artists is Bruce Hornsby. Really original artist, and there's just nobody like him. He's really one of a kind. And I could ask an AI to do an imitation of Bruce Hornsby, and it could do that, and it'd be like, okay, it'd be really lame, but sort of sounds vaguely Hornsby-esque.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to smudge Hornsby out of the music encyclopedia and try to feed AI all of the things that young Hornsby had listened to, all of the jazz, the classical, and the the rock and everything that influenced his style, and try to tell the AI, okay, now like come up with the sorts of things Hornsby was coming up with, it would never be able to do that.
Yeah.
It couldn't do that. It's never going to be genuinely creative.
Mm-hmm.
So true creativity will always have an audience.
Well, and that's what I've said oftentimes is this word artificial intelligence is incredibly unhelpful. Even the AI people will tell you artificial intelligence as a term is incredibly unhelpful because it doesn't mean much when you're trying to be specific about what you're talking about. But the word intelligence in artificial intelligence is a enthusiastic, probably overly optimistic word because of the thing you just said, is that one of the things that makes us uniquely intelligent as opposed to intelligent over and up against, like, say, a chimp or, a dolphin, is that we think counterfactually. We think in a sense where
Yes.
this thing doesn't exist, it ought to, and it's going to. And I'm going to work on that. And I think that's a reflection of part of the Imago Dei, which is the idea of the creative spark and the element of creation itself. I don't want to go too far with that because I do think that people who don't have, you're not more in God's image because you're more creative, but because you're the kind of creature that has the capacity for that creative nature, that intelligence that thinks of a world that ought to be different than it currently is. That makes you reflective of the divine in some way. I say that because I want to segue into something that you've talked about and written about, and your notion of aesthetic arrest. I would like to talk about that because people are spiritually hungry, and young people are flocking to traditional churches, which is interesting. I'd like to get your take on that, by the way. Some of the more liturgical styles, some of the less sort of Western evangelical Hillsongy churches, kind of a thing. They're going more towards liturgical churches, more traditional stuff, Orthodox churches, Catholic churches, etc. So I want to get your take on that in a minute. But your notion of aesthetic arrest might relate to that, I think, because you do have some sympathies or interest in, like, Catholicism, for example. So talk about that and what you mean.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about something I wrote for the Discovery Institute Science and Culture page.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking about this new documentary, The Story of Everything.
Right.
It's this really nice kind of summary of some of the scientific evidence for design. And I liked the way that they ended it because they talk about the argument from beauty.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at just all this unnecessary beauty in creation, and it doesn't seem to serve an evolutionary purpose, which is, if you think in those terms, everything has to serve a purpose in Darwinian terms, but there's so many things and you can try to come up with a narrative, but it becomes very strained at a certain point. Like, well, the pattern on a peacock's feathers helps him to mate better or something. It's
ad hoc. Yeah.
Yeah, very ad hoc, very much so. There's all kinds of they pile up. And so then this phrase aesthetic arrest actually comes from James Joyce, who's not one of my favorite writers. He's this very, kind of pretentious postmodern guy. But it's an interesting phrase, and it was introduced to me by the journalist writer Rod Dreher in his book Living in Wonder. And Dreher is talking about how when you're placed under aesthetic arrest, so to speak, it's different from being argued into the faith. It's not like a methodical presentation of reasons and evidence leading to a logical conclusion. It's just a sort of a sudden breaking in of something beautiful on our senses, and we kind of stand still. We're overwhelmed by it for a moment. It could be a great painting, a sunset, or a cathedral, right? And just kind of go, wow. Or another great example I bring up is the writer Whittaker Chambers, who defected from the Communist Party.
Mm-hmm.
He writes about how he was just observing his baby girl in her high chair, and he just noticed how beautiful her ear was. Just the incredible design of that, and it was this kind of all at once moment of like an epiphany of this. Her ear did not happen by accident. Like somebody created it. Somebody created that beautiful little baby ear.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of thing is it is a kind of evidence. It just because it isn't laid out in a methodical step 1, step 2, step 3 way, it doesn't mean that it isn't a good argument, because I think our intuitions often do reflect reality. They do point to something true. So then moving into this other topic you wanted to discuss of young people being drawn to aesthetic beauty in a church context. I agree that is a phenomenon that I see. I think there's a kind of a fatigue with big box evangelicalism in that sense. They like the priest wearing robes. They like the sacrament, crucifix, sacred art, that sort of stuff. People are drawn to that. Now, how deep that goes is an interesting question. I wonder to what extent it is merely an aesthetic attraction, and that maybe that will fade in time. They kind of, it's cool for a while, then they sort of move on to something else. That's a whole separate question, but there is somewhat of a revival there.
Yeah, and with that mere aesthetic attraction, I've heard versions of it, but with from an atheist, for atheists plural. I think, of course, of Dawkins' now famous statement that he's a cultural Christian because of the things that he finds beautiful that were actually created because of Christian faith, whether it's cathedrals or paintings and art, sculptures and hymns. The hymns was specifically interesting to me because it's one thing to admire a Michelangelo and say, my goodness, look at this, or a cathedral. But it's another thing to look at a hymn and say, that's beautiful, from someone like him, because the words and the content are so intertwined in the melody. That's why some of the older hymns are so beautiful. Like Isaac Watts's "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross" was so beautiful that it inspired my very first book. And so it's interesting to see someone like that say there's an aesthetic arrest, so to speak. Ehrman's new book is a good example of Love Thy Strangers, that aesthetic arrest. He's like, you look at Jesus's life and you think that's beautiful, but it doesn't have to be true. So there is this mirror, like it can draw you in, but it doesn't keep you there, so to speak.
Yeah, it's interesting that you raise Ehrman here, because I think I've made the comparison before between Ehrman and Tom Holland, because I think there is some interesting comparison there, except that Ehrman is just not as pleasant to engage with.
Yeah.
Like Holland is a nicer chap in that sense. But I mean, I think what's interesting, and this came out in this discussion that Ehrman had with Sean McDowell, where Sean was really gracious, I think, but kind of graciously held Ehrman's feet to the fire a little bit.
Yeah, he pressed them where others don't. Yeah. He
did, yeah, and I think I felt like Ehrman came across rather condescending in some ways. And Sean just took it very well and moved on, but it was just it didn't make Ehrman look good. But I think the problem is, on the one hand, Ehrman will say, sure, I've inherited this Christian programming, if you will. I've inherited this instinct to look at Jesus as an admirable and moral figure, and to want to imitate him by giving money to charity and all this good stuff. And isn't it great that society is organized this way? But it's all imitative. It's not grounded in objective reality about the universe. It's just we operate this way because it just kind of works out better for all of us. And that was where Sean was pressing. It's like, okay, so you're not going to say that it's true in some timeless, objective way that it's good to give money to the poor, right? This is sort of weird. But Ehrman, stuck to his guns on that. And to be honest, I think that's where Tom Holland is as well. Now, I think Ehrman maybe drew it out more clearly in his book because Ehrman is maybe a blunter writer in some
Right.
ways. But I think Holland is kind of operating under that same assumption. He doesn't really think that this is an objective reality. He's just like, gee, I'm so glad that I happened to be born in a world after Jesus, and isn't that nice? But, you can look at all of these other cultures, pre-Christian cultures that seem very alien to us, but that was kind of how they operated. And yes, I'm going to say they're bad, but that's because I'm in my subjective Christian bubble. And he can't, I don't think he has a very good philosophical foundation in that sense.
Well, and that's one of the things that I wrote about in Fake ID is one of the essential arguments. It's an argument that I get to eventually because I did want to sort of argue to Christianity is in light of the current sort of remaking a human being, transhumanism, gender identity issues, all this stuff, the constant desire to essentially repair the failure of Eden, where, in my view, transhumanism, this is a little bit left sort of off field here, but it's getting there, I promise, is part of the reason why I think that there is this constant state of desire to redeem Eden's failure is because what the transhumanists might say is that Eden's failure was not immoral. Eden's failure was that it was premature. We now have this ability to not only make a God we can merge with, but God himself can't make his own God, and we can do such a thing. And now we get to shake our fist at him. And we see this in Genesis 3. We see this in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel. We see this numerous times throughout the pages of Scripture, whether it's the people of God who fall back into that or the people outside of the people of God who are doing it over and over again. And so one of the things I think is akin to aesthetic arrest in some ways, but is this idea that beauty and truth can continue on and can be indicative of the veracity of a worldview, is that the Bible has this uncanny ability to predict and diagnose the human condition across cultures and across centuries in the way that no other book has, which suggests that it's not the concoction of a handful of fishermen and some shepherds, but maybe it's guided by the one who made those shepherds and fishermen, and the various poets and kings as well who've written into it, many of whom were shepherds and fishermen to start. So I think there is a real argument there, and an argument from beauty I think is a good one. I don't think it's as popular as it ought to be, but I think that there is something there. And the fact that there are some atheists who are at least recognizing some level of utility, or not utility, well, utility is the right word probably for them, that the beauty of not only the moral message, but the actual artistic expression of Christianity in culture is valuable and worth hanging on to and keeping and having it endure. So,
yeah, and I think a figure that hasn't come up yet, but I enjoy her work is Louise Perry. She's an English sort of I would call her a feminist, but she's sort of like a first wave feminist, and she's written very well, against latter age feminism. But she's been on her own spiritual journey, and she's really, I think it's been fun to watch her think out loud, because I think she's been moving in a direction that past where some of these other writers are stuck, because she's started to say things like, well, maybe this stuff works because it's true. And like maybe the beautiful way that this all seems to fit together, and the way that it seems to accurately capture human nature and these sorts of things, it's just indicative of the fact that this is real. It's capturing something about reality, and it isn't just that it works. This all fits together. This is the inference to the best explanation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think she now says she would think of herself as a Christian. Now, I think she's still kind of in process with different things, but she's been explicitly walking along that path, and that's been cool to see.
Well, and I think of the person who's a little more on the out there, like headline grabbing person, who is a similar, not exactly the same, but similar stories. Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Someone who's gone through she went through one worldview that I used to espouse, Islam, found that to be wanting, and then embraced atheism, became a darling of the atheist community and a friend of Dawkins and others who came to faith not only because the unyielding despair of the world around her just simply didn't give her the answers that Christianity did, but it also was a bulwark against some of the things she thought were destroying that which was good and beautiful in the world, and then has come to see not only the utility of Christianity, but also the truth of it. And she's growing more and more in her faith as well, which is great. So she's a great example of this. All right, the time runs short on our conversation. We have to have a part two, and we'll talk about a couple more things specifically and maybe focus the conversation more. But this is what I thought would happen, and I'm actually delighted. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. I definitely have.
I have. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes, very much so.
you're because you're thoughtful, and we can talk about a lot of different things. If you were to say your favorite argument in favor of the Christian faith, what would you say is your favorite one, sort of a go-to or one that you find most appealing? It doesn't even have to be the strongest, but typically the strongest are the best ones. So just curious as to what you think is like, boy, if someone said, give me your best argument for Christianity, and you got, a few minutes to start it, which one would it be?
Wow. I think so. I think in broad outline, it would be the texture of the Gospels, because to me they just leap out as so raw and so real, and almost in a way mundane, but sort of beautifully mundane. And I think it's difficult to read them and not be powerfully struck that these guys saw something. Like they had an encounter with this remarkable person. And then to narrow that down even more, I think the argument from Jesus' character is one that I find very compelling, and the unity of his character across the Gospels, and just this intriguing combination of characteristics where he's saying all of these things where if he weren't in fact God, it would be rather unsettling and even creepy in some ways. Like who does he think he is? Yeah. Well, he's glad you asked. I guess he's going to tell you who he thinks he is, right? Yeah. Since you were wondering. Yeah. But it's just, and like on one hand, he's incredibly self-assured and very bold, and he's like, yep, I definitely have the power to forgive sins. That is a thing I can do. But then on the other hand, he's very humble. He washes the disciples' feet. He like you were referring to earlier, he speaks with outsiders, social outsiders, and he's not fussy or worried about that. And then ultimately, of course, he sacrifices himself for the world. Yeah. And he's just, you never get to the bottom of Jesus. Just an endlessly compelling figure.
Yeah. You never get to the bottom of Jesus. That's really good. We're talking about this idea of the mundane, but beautifully mundane, but also incredibly powerful at the moment in speaking with outsiders. I've spoken about this a lot, and I write about it in one of my books. There's a conversation Jesus has with a woman. She comes, a woman of the city, the gospel calls her, and she comes in and she is, crying over her redemption, and she's just anointing Jesus' feet with her tears, as it were. She's washing his feet with her tears, and then wiping them dry with her hair. And the Pharisee, the religious leader who didn't provide a bowl for Jesus, which was customary, is thinking these horrible thoughts about her and about Jesus as well. As if you were really who you thought you were, you would know who's touching you exactly. And this detail that's in the Gospels, it's mundane. But it's the kind of thing, and Lewis points this out too, is that ancient writing like this didn't include this level of stuff always. It rarely did, where he had that phenomenon, and anybody can realize this, especially if you've been scolded by your parents when you were a kid, is he looks at her and talks to him. And the Bible points it out. He looks at her and says to him, do you see this woman? Like, that's a detail that's amazing. He looks at her, and while he's seeing her, he's saying to him, do you see her? Because you don't. And you didn't even do this for me. Of course you wouldn't do this for this woman who you think is of low repute. And it's one of those details that's mundane and beautiful at the same time. It goes back to that character thing. So I'm with you. I think that's a great argument in favor of the reasons why we should pay attention to the gospel messages. as well. Well, there's more to get to. We could have. I promised we were going to get to the Nick Fuentes thing, but because I would love to get your take on why people are listening to Nick Fuentes now, in light of everything. But maybe we'll put a pin in it. Maybe we'll make that a teaser for another conversation, because I do think it relates to we've been lied to by the establishment, and here comes this guy who says this kind of stuff. So to be continued. But where can people find your stuff and learn more about what it is you're writing about? And you write in a bunch of different places. You're freelancing all over the place, but you have a Substack.
I do, yes, and the Substack is my spot. It's my little garden. It's ad free. It's Substack. It's a great platform for readers as well as writers. And so I am parked at furtherup.net. And yes, Further Up is a Lewisian allusion. And my logo is a lamppost. Mm-hmm. So it's on my business cards and everything. So that's kind of my home base. But then, yeah, I do freelance. I write quite a bit for World Magazine, mm-hmm. and semi-regularly in First Things, and a few other places too. And you were mentioning that I tweet a lot. I still like to call it Twitter. I am in rebellion. I refuse to call it X. Twitter is just a much better name in many ways.
Agreed.
But I spend whatever you want to call it, I spend way too much time there. And I really need to get my, my priorities together as far as time management. But I have to admit, it is sort of a public square, and it's a great place to gossip and pick up news and connect with people. Mm-hmm. And so, you can find me tweeting with great frequency there if you're on Twitter.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we'll put links to everything in the show notes in the description if you're watching or if you're listening as well. So, Bethel, thanks for having the conversation with me. It was a lot of fun. It was wide-ranging. We didn't center on any one thing, but we talked about a lot of great things, I think, in depth. So I'm really thankful for the conversation. Friends, I typically have a closing argument at the end of All Rise. You've heard a lot of stuff today, and if anything, I think one of the important points for you to get, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is to go back and make sure we find out if something is true based on the evidence of it, not based on whether we like what the outcome will be. And Bethel talked about that quite a bit, and I think that's really important. So if there's one thing I leave you with, it would be that. The whole conversation was dancing around that, but also spoke about it directly. So go back and give it a listen or a watch if you want to hear more about that. I hope we can have you on again, Bethel. Thanks for joining us on All Rise.